Relationship between white Canadians and Japanese Canadians prior to the events of Pearl Harbor and the eventual attack on Hong Kong was a turbulent one filled of hatred and skepticism. The first generation of Japanese immigrants called EC arrived in British Columbia from 1877 to 1928. When they arrived in Canada, Japanese Canadian relationship with whites was already strained. In 1874, many white supremacists were pushing for no Asians to live in Canada. As a result, in 1895, Japanese Canadians were barred from voting in both provincial and federal elections. Even a 1902 court challenging, arguing that they were British subjects, did not overturn the ruling. In 1908, Canada made a gentleman's agreement with Japan that limited the number of males migrating to Canada to just 400 a year. This was due to the 1907 Vancouver riots, which was caused by false fears that the Japanese were importing an army into Canada due to the Russo-Japanese War, and as a result, as many as 9,000 Japanese shop windows were smashed. This was further reduced to 150 people a year in 1928 once Japanese families started migrating to Canada. Japanese Canadians were also excluded from unions and forced to work on farms or menial jobs, which meant that they worked longer hours while making less money than their white counterparts. Some other examples of hatred include the federal government reducing the amount of fishing license given out to Japanese fishermen in 1922 and denying them social insurance help during the Great Depression. The British Columbia government even went as far as denying Japanese Canadians logging license as well. Once the Second World War started in 1939, Japanese Canadians were excluded from the draft to prevent them from having an argument for the right to vote. In March of 1941, the Canadian government ordered all Japanese Canadians to register with the federal government regardless if they were British subjects or not. This policy was put forward by the Federal Point Advisory Group of Special Committee on Orientals, essentially made Japanese Canadians to be declared as enemy aliens, all but setting the stage for their internment later on in the war.
The attack on Pearl Harbor had taken all Canadians by surprise. However, feelings of dismay were particularly felt by Japanese Canadians. Following the declaration of war, the nation was gripped by fear, as the attack had ushered in the opening of an additional front for the Allied forces. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, relations between Japanese Canadians and the nation were already strained. For Japanese Canadians, the effects would be felt immediately. Despite the shared feelings of anger toward the Empire of Japan, their own country would come to view them as a threat. One day after Pearl Harbor, 2 Canadian regiments of Sea Force based in Hong Kong would be in direct conflict with the Japanese. After the subsequent occupation of Hong Kong by the Japanese, the remaining Canadian soldiers would be sent to prisoner of war camps, where hundreds would perish under brutal conditions. News of this engagement and the subsequent imprisonment would further damage views toward the Japanese and garner support for their internment as enemy aliens of the state. Canadians and the federal government worried that Japanese Canadians would act as saboteurs or spies. This xenophobia and suspicion would lead to their dismissal from key industries such as the Canadian Pacific Railway. This also led to the confiscation of fishing vessels and radios, as it was feared they would use them to communicate with the enemy. As was chronicled in the internment diary of Mary Kobayashi, lingering feelings of suspicion and prejudice toward Japanese communities would be amplified and ultimately lead to the relocation from the coastal regions of the West Coast to internment camps in the BC interior.
Propaganda was used to fuel anti-Japanese sentiments prior to and during the Second World War. In newspaper articles, posters, comics, and other caricatures, Japanese Canadians were portrayed negatively as economic menaces to white Canadian job security. Specifically, they were targeted for impressing upon the fish trade, farming, mining, and government projects in British Columbia. They were deemed untrustworthy, sneaky, and filled with cowardice. After the events of Pearl Harbor and the bombings in Hong Kong, such sentiments were further magnified. The Japanese were now understood to be a major security threat given Japan's alliance with Germany during the war. As such, they began to be depicted as evil, menacing, and aggressive, with particular features such as eyes and teeth drawn and broken English written in accordance with Western stereotypes. Furthermore, they were also depicted as unintelligent and crude. Ideas were perpetuated in these caricatures, which suggested that Japanese Canadians were loyal to Emperor Hirohito of Japan, and thus disloyal to Canada, and could potentially attack from within. These ideas, as understood through propaganda, contributed heavily to Japanese Canadian internment. And while the wartime measure which led to internment was issued to remove any and all persons from any protective area in the country, Japanese Canadians were disproportionately affected. In reality, Japanese Canadians showed their loyalty to Canada in many ways, including but not limited to purchasing war bonds. Many of them purchased at least $300,000 worth. Shown here is a certificate of honor hanging inside the window of a Japanese Canadian store. These certificates were issued only to those who purchased victory loans in Canada. For all of their contributions benefiting this country, Canada vilified Japanese Canadians, exhibited nowhere more pertinently than within its propaganda.
Japanese Canadians were very cooperative throughout the process of internment as their rights were progressively stripped away. Despite prevailing anti-Japanese sentiment, Navy insiders openly admitted that they were very good citizens. There were no spy rings ever uncovered by the RCMP, and there were no marches in support of Emperor Hirohito. Major General Maurice Pope, Vice Chief of the General Staff in Ottawa, famously said, "From the Army point of view, I cannot see that they, Japanese Canadians, constitute the slightest menace to national security." One internment survivor stated in an interview, "We were all law-abiding citizens. We always believed that you obeyed the rules, and that's the way we were raised." It was even documented that Japanese Canadians were not trying to argue their way out of being interned. In a letter penned by the hastily convened Nisei mass evacuation group, they write, "The answer is that we are by law Japanese nationals, and we have to do what we are told and go where we are sent. We, however, know that we are Canadians and that we are going to continue all efforts to get what we feel are our rights." Internment was a shock to them, but their overall positive disposition remained. This is reflected in several phrases which have become common parlance in describing how adults tried to cope. "Shikate ga ne," it cannot be helped, and "gambare," do your best. The first generation was very resilient. They didn't sit around complaining about what the government had done, said Pat Adachi, who experienced internment at age 21. They got busy and made gardens and grew vegetables. While their positive disposition and sense of Canadian identity remained largely undeterred by their internment, this was far from the only injustice that Japanese Canadians faced during the 1940s. A book by Jordan Stranger Ross, Nicholas Blomley, and the Landscapes of Injustice Research Collective, called Landscapes of Injustice, A New Perspective on the Internment and Dispossession of Japanese Canadians, compiled 292 letters written by Japanese Canadians who were protesting the sale of their property between 1943 and 1947. These letters helped to uncover important perspectives of Japanese Canadians that have been largely forgotten in the history of the Japanese Canadian internment era. In these letters to the federal government, Japanese Canadians expressed that beyond their displacement and economic hardships, they also experienced significant injustice due to the dispossession of their property. Japanese Canadians, like other owners, made multiple and deeply felt investments of time, labor, love, pride, and connection to their homes, land, businesses, and belongings. It is important to recognize the significant loss experienced by Japanese Canadians as a result of the dispossession of their property.
These references to the multiple investments in their property, often made over decades of living in Canada, were an attempt by Japanese Canadians to prove their status as good owners, as people committed to the places they lived, and as people who belonged. Many also pleaded against the sale of their property based on the expectations and future benefits that they had attached to their property. As such, the undervalued sale of their property, despite their pleas to the government, erased these investments and served to destroy both the history and future of Japanese Canadians in Canada. It is important to note that these letters of protest sent to the government demonstrate that despite their internment, Japanese Canadians had a continued sense of identification with Canada. Even during their internment, Japanese Canadians had faith that they could reason with the Canadian government and could appeal to basic rules of fairness when it came to property ownership and exchange. Many of the protest letters written by Japanese Canadians suggested that as Canadian citizens, they believed in the contractual obligations of the government in Canada. Many letters make reference to the concept of consent. Japanese Canadians did not consent to the sale of their property, and as citizens, they believed that they had the power to deny the sale of their property. Thus, the unconsented sale of their property marked an important turning point in Japanese Canadians' identification as Canadian citizens, as it represented a violation of a foundational contract of democratic governance between Canadian citizen and state. In the grand scheme of the displacement and internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, Japanese Canadians' unconsented loss of property constituted a particular kind of injustice, which stood distinct from the wider array of policies that overturned their lives in the 1940s. This dispossession represented a sentiment of malice towards Japanese Canadians that had no plausible connection to securing coastal British Columbia during the war. As a result, the dispossession of Japanese Canadians during the internment era had important implications for not only Japanese Canadians' identification as Canadians, but also their future in Canada. For more information, please access any of the following resources.